Right, well, good morning, everyone. Very warm welcome to the Charles Taylor webinar, EL and PL claims arising from COVID-19. Are you prepared for the emerging fraud risk? My name is Nick Patterson, and I'm the Director of the UK and International Liability team for Charles Taylor Adjusting. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd just like to cover off a couple of housekeeping items. The first is, please note that the session is being recorded, and we will send all attendees a follow-up email with a copy of the recording in due course. At the end of the webinar, you will be asked to complete a short survey. This shouldn't take too long, and we'd be very grateful for your feedback and suggestions for future events. And just so you're all aware, all attendees are muted. However, if you do have any questions throughout, please type them into the question box on your side panel, and I'd appreciate any questions that you might have, which I can then put to our panel later. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speakers. First of all, Greg Molyneaux, an Associate Director, of the UK Liability team. Greg has worked as a loss adjuster for over 30 years, specialising in liability claims for both national and international carriers and corporates. He particularly specialises in complex injury claims. And next, Simon Cook has worked in various roles in the insurance industry, 16 years working in counter fraud. He set up our multi-award-winning specialist investigation services in 2008 and is a regular contributor to the media about insurance fraud, including BBC One's Claimed and Shamed fraud series. So that's our speakers, and I'd first of all like to hand over to Greg. Greg, over to you.
Thanks, Nick. Hi, everyone. I think it was inevitable that when I was preparing for this webinar, there'd be contractors arriving outside to dig up the road, but I hope you can hear me okay. And as Nick's referred to my long career in loss adjusting, I think the COVID-19 pandemic has probably had one of the most fundamental effects on the way in which I work and the way in which we handle claims in the liability claims arena. I think up until recently, before the pandemic, we'd gone through a fairly calm period in the liability claims space. Certainly after the portal came in 2013, there hadn't been very many significant events, but this one, of course, has come along to change all that. I think 12 months into the pandemic, the position's clearly still evolving, and what I'm trying to do is to show you some patterns that I think have emerged in that period, notwithstanding. In the presentation, I'll present some of my thoughts on the pandemic, the sorts of claims that we're likely to see coming through as a result of it, and some thoughts on how we handle those claims also. I'll outline the duty that employers and those controlling workspaces have, and we'll talk about causation, which is also likely to be quite a significant area of disagreement and perhaps litigation in the future. And looking forwards, I'll present my thoughts on the likely impacts on new and existing claims we've got on our desks, and some changes that I also foresee happening in our work systems and our work environments. And as we go through the vaccination phase, I'll talk about some of the issues that I think could result from that too. So what types of claim are we seeing? Well, certainly the largest tranche of claims that we're seeing so far is for COVID-19 infection, people attending work or people visiting public spaces or supermarkets, that sort of thing. And I think that's the largest source of claims that we're seeing at the moment coming through. I think many of these claims are being pursued simply on the basis of a COVID positive test and oral evidence as to where people might have been in a specific place at a given point in time. And I think with those dimensions alone, there's likely to be quite a large speculative number of claims, and also a high incidence of fraud too. We're seeing some claims resulting from COVID-enforced changes. I'm thinking people have maybe doing things that they're not used to doing in their job, perhaps things that they haven't been adequately trained to do, and also people doing jobs with fewer colleagues in support. And I think as many of us are doing more and more work from home, we're likely to see, and have seen already, some musculoskeletal injury cases, people perhaps who haven't got adequate workstations and work equipment at home like many of us have here today. And also, we're expecting some work-related stress claims. I'm thinking mainly of junior or sort of younger workers, those who are perhaps more used to going into a traditional office setting and getting support from colleagues. My son, who's currently on a civil engineering apprenticeship, who's been working at home for the last 12 months, I think he'd certainly like to get back and get back round the table and into his design meetings and learn from colleagues and so on at his stage of his career. And also vicarious liability. We keep hearing of anecdotal evidence about people refusing to work from, refusing to isolate when they might have symptoms and continuing working. I think we're expecting to see vicarious liability claims come through as a result, both from fellow employees and also third parties. So just to summarise the duty, I'm sure you've all seen slides like this. Many of the cases that we're seeing, the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974 is commonly quoted. Sections 2 and 3, you'll remember, provide a duty to employees and visitors to premises for risks from their health and safety. The duty isn't absolute, and it's recognised that those controlling premises have to just take reasonable care, often referred to in the government guidelines as taking adequate preventative measures. I think many of the letters of claim that we're seeing refer to the workplace regulations, and I think it's important to realise that those are the benchmark standard for employers controlling workspaces. The ones that we're seeing commonly are the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations 99, where you'll remember under Regulation 3, there's a duty to complete an adequate risk assessment. So in this case, we would expect to see a COVID-19 risk assessment. And also the PPE Regulations 92, where employers should provide adequate PPE and enforce a regime of compliance. And also document and training should support those initiatives. I think what we've seen with cases so far is that many employers and those controlling premises have got these systems in place, perhaps some administrative deficiencies, but some are more or less compliant with those initiatives. And I think the default position would be to try and, in any response to any claim, is to try and paint a more positive picture of what the employer or the site occupier is doing. So talking about causation, this is likely to be a very big area of disagreement. I think we're still learning a lot about the virus insofar as the incubation period is concerned. I still think the current thinking is it could be anything up to 14 days. And if you bear that in mind, I think it's going to be very difficult for people to establish where they contracted the virus at a given point at a specific location. Obviously, the Fairchild case is an exception to that rule. That involved a MESO case, obviously, and that went in favour of the claimant, who simply had to show that the virus was contracted but for the claimant's negligence. But I think it's very difficult for me to see parallels being drawn with that case in the context of a very highly transmissible virus, which is very easy to catch where people go about their normal business. And in a typical day, if you can imagine, people might go to work, they might visit their supermarket on the way home, and then they spend the rest of the evening at home with other members of their family, each of whom are subject to their own sources of infection. Then it's going to be very difficult for people to show that they got the virus at a specific place and a point in time. I think from a personal point of view, I've seen this at quite close quarters. My daughter, who's currently at sixth form college studying A-levels, she had the virus recently, but ironically enough, she went through the whole period up to the winter till Christmas, going to college day to day, where there were many cases where people had contracted COVID at her college. She was unaffected at that point, and then she caught the virus at the beginning of January, when she hadn't seen any of her colleagues for 2 or 3 weeks before the Christmas break. So I think in that context, it's just very difficult to see how the virus is contracted. And then in the following period, we had this sort of very bizarre situation where she was in her room. I'm sure some of you have been through this yourselves. She was in her bedroom. We were taking her meals up and drinks up on a tray, and she had her own bathroom to use and so on. And, you know, we had to go through that for about 10 days, obviously trying to prevent the virus from spreading to other members of the family. And when she actually came out of that period, we were fortunate enough that we weren't affected. But looking back on it, up until the point that she had her positive test, we were living as a normal family, sharing meal times and so on, and none of us contracted the virus. So I think just with those facts alone, it's going to be very difficult for people to prove beyond reason on the balance of probabilities where they contracted the virus at any given point. And obviously, if they are able to say that they caught the virus in a specific place, then we go back to whether it was negligent or non-negligent exposure, back to the previous slide where we talked about the duties. So what are the impacts likely to be on new and existing claims? Well, I think fundamentally what I'm seeing is a reduction in claim numbers. People are not going into traditional workplaces. People are not going out and doing things that they would do in the numbers that previously they did, and that's consequentially led to a reduction in new claims. But we are seeing some effects on the claims that we have on our desks. We're expecting the value of those cases to increase. I've got some cases where we've got rehab that's we're finding it difficult to put in place actively and to make a difference in people's recovery. We've got case managers who can't access their clients and provide rehab in a more proactive way. We're seeing mental health issues consequent upon people feeling unsupported. We're also seeing difficulties in people returning to work if their job is furloughed. And also, I think in the current climate, employers are simply not as flexible enough to be able to give graduated return to work opportunities for those who are coming back to work after a period of being out. We're expecting some impact on the life cycle of claims. We found some IT solutions to overcome those, but I think invariably there's going to be a delay in closing our cases, getting expert evidence, court delays, that sort of thing spring to mind. And also on claims handling, I think we've all participated in remote JSMs and mediations, and they've on the whole worked quite well, and I think some of those things could continue. But I think invariably we're going to be dealing with claims in a different way. I myself have investigated cases remotely, asking people to share their screen and look at different situations in factories, and some of those, I must be honest, have proved quite successful. And I think there is some truth in there's nothing like seeing things firsthand, but I think we have coped quite well in many cases. And for those dealing with catastrophic injury cases, I think there could be some changes there, especially in relation to PPOs. They've sort of really fallen out of fashion, but I think courts might see that there's a need to look at an increased use in PPOs, and I think insurers might welcome that rather than paying very large upfront settlements, especially in the case of people who are vulnerable as a result of COVID. And we've seen through historical data that I think when we go through a period of recession, there's high unemployment, there is also a consequential effect on the number of fraudulent claims that we see. So my colleague Simon will cover that in a bit more detail shortly. So what are the impacts on the way we might work in the future? Well, I think the first thing we have to do is to reintegrate the workforce, and that's going to invariably involve a period of retraining. People are going to have to think about how they get to their workplaces and commuting, and also whilst children and college students have been given dates now to return, I think people still will have childcare issues for vulnerable children and so on. I think our workplace is likely to change significantly. The cases that I am visiting on site, I'm seeing a lot of changes in people's workplaces. I think invariably that's got to start from an adequate risk assessment. And I think we'll see higher regimes of cleaning, implementing of social distancing, and generally keeping people apart at work as best as can be done. I think you'll remember under Regulation 6 of the Management of Health and Safety at Work regulations, there's a duty on employers to provide continuing health surveillance. So we're likely to see use of sort of return to work forms for those returning to a workplace after a period of absence or holiday. There's probably going to be some sort of a formalized system of reporting of your symptoms if people have a change to how they're feeling and symptoms that they might be affected by. And also there's probably going to be changes in equipment at workplaces, temperature checks and that sort of thing going forward. But for those who have the opportunity to work from home, I think that's going to continue for many of us, especially if you've got a nice view from your workstation, as you can see in that slide there. I think many of us have quite liked to spend more time working from home than the flexibility that provides. I think invariably what we might see is a balance of people doing more work from home, maybe going into offices to attend meetings, see customers and that sort of thing. But there are some people, I think, who will be generally glad to get back to an office environment. And we're obviously balancing all these decisions with people's mental health about the feeling of being isolated and so on. But I think as people do more and more work from home, there will be a higher reliance on IT and resourcing of that from employers, a higher level of training, perhaps for people like myself who've avoided IT to a certain extent or as much as they could for some periods, and also a reduction in office space. And I think we're seeing many employers actually turning around and thinking, how much space do we actually need if people are not coming into work day to day, and this might be a pattern for future. And I think generally, I think employers are going to really review their operating systems. As I said, some things have worked very well in this period. I think there will be a continuing increase in AI and automation and a reduction for office space. I think also people's supply chain will be looked at very closely. We've all perhaps thought about where we buy our things from, who we sell our services to, and how we interact with our customers in this period. And some of those changes, I think, will stay in the longer term. So finally, for my bit, I wanted to talk about the vaccination issues, and that's likely to throw up a number of risk factors. We've had a very rapid rollout of the COVID-19 vaccines. There have been a very condensed period of longitudinal studies in relation to their efficacy. And also, I think people are worried about the potential long-term effects of the vaccines, and particularly how the vaccine might affect other people taking other drugs, such as cancer and that sort of thing. So what is the position for vaccination manufacturers and others in the supply chain in terms of product liability? Well, you'll know from the human medicines regulations, there's a civil immunity, there's an immunity confirmed through civil liability for loss or damage resulting from unlicensed products. And that has been extended to COVID-19 in amendment regulations of 2020. That immunity is, however, removed when there's a significantly serious breach of a condition relating to the authorization process, and that will be for courts to determine. And moreover, under Regulation 345 of the Human Medicines Regs, the right is reserved for people to bring a defective product claim under the CPA. So that's something that I expect to see developing. But I think people who manufacture products might have a high use of product warnings on their labeling and packaging. And there's also likely to be a significant debate around scientific and technical knowledge defense, which you'll know is a defense under the CPA too. But I suppose all of that could be curtailed if the government continues to extend its legal indemnity to companies producing the COVID-19 vaccine. And you'll know that the Pfizer have already been given that legal indemnity, and I expect that to be extended for other vaccine manufacturers. So I hope you found that of some interest. And now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Simon, who will talk about some of the fraud issues that I've touched on. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone on the webinar today is staying safe and well. Thank you very much indeed to Greg for a really informative presentation. Now, it's clear that COVID is already making a significant impact on the insurance industry in so many ways. That kind of leads me on to my presentation today, which is surrounding the emerging threat of fraud as a result of the COVID pandemic. So just the agenda today, I think it's wise to firstly set the scene about the insurance fraud issue in the UK market. It's then about everyone being prepared for the emerging risk and what will the landscape look like in 6 to 12 months' time. Then going to look at the motivation of a fraudster, and then we're going to look at whether you can actually stereotype a fraudster. And finally, I'm going to talk about how we're currently investigating liability claims. So as I said, just to start with, I think it's really important to set the scene about insurance fraud in the UK market. It's not by any means a new topic. It's spoken about at all insurance companies, executive levels, and stories about insurance fraud are regularly spoken about in the media. I don't think there's a day that goes by now that I don't sort of read the news and there's something in there about insurance fraud. There's even a long-standing BBC series, Claimed and Shamed, that focuses on insurance fraud. And as an industry, we have a dedicated police force, IFED, the Insurance Fraud Enforcement Department, within the City of London Police that solely deals with insurance fraud issues. So the insurance fraud industry is worth circa about £100 million per year. It's a business within its own right. The £100 million is spent by insurers, just trying to validate insurance claims with the likes of statement taking, social media investigations, which is something that I'm going to come on to a bit later, video interviewing, surveillance, and much more, all of which are used to, validate insurance claims. So, but that circa £100 million, that doesn't even take into account the multi-million-pound industry of automated fraud detection software, which a lot of companies heavily invest in these days to deploy within their organisations. So I just think it's good to put some statistics and numbers surrounding fraud in the UK market. And in September 2020, the ABI released their statistics from 2019, and they had £1.2 billion worth of insurance fraud reported, which shockingly amounts to 107,000 fraudulent claims. It still amazes me when I say that, but out of the 107,000 fraudulent claims that were reported, 19,000 of those were attributed to liability claims. So in summary, fraud is and still remains a significant issue within the UK. So, are we prepared for the emerging risk moving forward, and just looking at the landscape in the next 6 to 12 months? And whether it's a pandemic or a recession, it creates hardship and a need or greed or situation for the minority of customers and claimants. A pandemic and or a recession is, an ideal time for that opportunistic fraudster. So if an insurer is known to be like an easy target, a fraudster may decide to target that insurer, take out a policy with them, as it could be seen as an easy path to make a quick buck. They may get away with a first claim, but then become greedy and return to the insurer to make a second higher value claim, or they might choose a different product line and take out a policy there, or even target different insurers. I think it is really fair to say that our industry, the insurance industry, is vulnerable during surge events, and that's possibly due to a lack of resources, poor technology, where, for example, your systems don't speak to one another, and increased delegated authority thresholds are given to providers. This is why it's just so important to have a robust fraud policy, sufficient escalation processes, and technology to assist with fraud detection. But also you need to have investigation toolkit, like a significant investigation toolkit, to ensure you have the right level of services to help you validate claims. I'd also state this is an ideal opportunity for you to conduct some fraud awareness training for your staff. So fraud is at the forefront of their mind, but it's also to ensure that they recognise a genuine claimant as well, which is really, really important. Those claims can then get paid, as opposed to potentially that genuine customer being put through an unnecessary fraud process. So with the government funded schemes such as furlough and bounce back loans due to end in the, pretty soon, I would have thought, and the country essentially then being in a recession, this is where I think you're going to really see the increase in fraud. Unfortunately, job losses are inevitable, and that's financial pressures on individuals, and that can make people look elsewhere to make money. So fraudulent insurance claims, I think, are sometimes still seen as a bit of a sort of Christmas club, where you put your money into it and then you want to get your money out of it, like a return on your investment, effectively. So what we've also seen as well in this situation is that the insurers have different tolerances to insurance fraud, and no two organisations have the same philosophies about fraud. Some insurers have a zero tolerance approach, which is certainly, for me, the way forward, and my colleagues is the way forward. However, some insurers don't. They may look at fraud in a more commercial sense, but it's important to have really good suppliers in place who will align with your own internal fraud strategy and collaborate with you. I've spoken with some clients over the years who have said to me that they don't have a fraud problem working in insurance, and I think the simple fact is that every insurer in the UK has a potential fraud exposure, and what needs to just be established is where your organisation really sits within the counter fraud spectrum. We should also consider the fact that claimants who have had genuine accidents pre-COVID may now have those financial pressures, which forces them to think of other ways where they could potentially get money from. So they could then try and exaggerate what was initially a completely genuine claim, a genuine incident, just in order to try and get additional funds. So now I'm going to look at the motivation, the fraudster profiles and motivation. Up on the slide here for everyone on the webinar. Please have a read through that. But what I'm going to focus on is the opportunistic and the desperation fraudsters, which is, I see being a problem. It's much more likely that we're going to see more opportunistic and desperation fraud as a result of this pandemic. And this goes sort of back to what I discussed earlier about the financial hardship, where someone that you wouldn't normally consider would commit insurance frauds, they may now be forced into potentially doing that, or see that opportunity to make some money through their insurance policy. But what I frequently say when conducting presentations like this is, despite all my years of working within the the insurance fraud arena, I can quite honestly say that you just cannot stereotype someone who commits insurance fraud. We see all manner of different people committing fraud, from doctors to senior managers in large corporations, right through to low-income earners and the unemployed. I do feel with the more professional type of people who sometimes commit fraud, they see the situation as sort of sense of entitlement from the insurance policy. So I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. So if something isn't potentially covered by the insurance policy, they will try and manipulate the true circumstances in order to get cover. So just going on to investigating a liability claim, if you feel there is a sort of potential fraudulent element. Now, I know a lot of people on the webinar today are very experienced, and I'm certainly not here to teach you to suck eggs by any means, but I thought it was important just to give some hints and tips about how we go about investigating some of the liability claims that we deal with. So, now, as a claims assessor or an investigator, you will always have, a gut feeling when something just doesn't feel right with the claim. This is, something that no kind of red flag or fraud indicator checklist or even automated fraud detection software can, really give you. The red flags and fraud indicators that we all have in place are, merely a guide for the claims assessor and investigator. It doesn't mean by at all that the claim is fraud. But what would you do if you have a gut feeling about a claim, or what triggers, or some of the red flags have been triggered, and what information can you potentially find about the claimant that may give you that additional piece of the sort of jigsaw that you need to help you make that informed decision about whether to officially conduct an investigation into the claim to make sure it's genuine and you're validating that particular claim. And social media is not by any means a new investigative tool. I'm sure everyone's aware of this. Especially when you're wanting to know more about a claimant when they're making an injury or a liability claim. And it's social media is without question an enabler for you to conduct that further investigation into the claim. But it's of course, extremely important that when you use social media that it's conducted, in an ethical way, and you're only using sort of data that's considered to be open source. So, essentially that's in the public domain that anyone can view. So it's, a lot of people these days, openly live their lives on, social media, and it really never ceases to amaze me the type of information that people actually put on their security, put on social media with their security settings that are set as open. It's absolutely unbelievable. And whether they're boasting about the recent dinner that they've just cooked, or they're talking about their gym session maybe, or even the workout they've just had, or they're even uploading sort of mapping images of the recent jog that they've gone on, which is something I've certainly seen a lot more of in recent months. And it's crazy really, because that just gives people sort of an intimate sort of look into your life. It really does. So, and videos on social media are becoming even more prevalent than the static photos that we're used to. And there's an app out there, or a sort of system called social media site, called TikTok, which I'm sure everyone's heard of. And it's definitely the latest social media craze. And I can safely say from my perspective that you will never get me going on social media and doing a little dance to a Weekend number, although some of my friends and colleagues who know me well would say otherwise, some of which will be on the webinar today. So that's probably given them a bit of a laugh there. But you would be really surprised how many claimants that we find just doing that. So, for example, they're saying they're incapacitated, they can't move, they can't do anything at all. But then on social media, you're then finding them doing these dances and things like that. So it's it's a great tool. It really is. And you could also use social media investigations multiple times through the life of the claim as well. It's not something that you would just necessarily do once, because ultimately circumstances change, and some injuries, certainly where rehabilitation is required, they do take some time. So social media's investigations, they are as well that key enabler where you would then decide, whether you take the sort of leap and appoint surveillance to actually go out and monitor the claimant's movements, which would assess either the validity of the claim or clear that fraud risk for you, or it might give you that additional information where the sort of injury and the symptoms could be challenged. If a claimant's, for example, saying they can't work, and then you're filming them going to work and potentially working, then that's a big issue. And we've had quite a few situations in sort of the last 6 to 12 months where that has happened, to the point where once disclosed the evidence by adjusting teams to the claimant solicitors, the sort of litigation and claim is discontinued. So this will now lead me on to talking very briefly, like a light touch, on fundamental dishonesty. I'm not going to profess to be a solicitor or a lawyer by any means, but we all need to be aware of this when looking at potential exaggerated claims during the life of that liability event or injury claim that you're dealing with. So it's just really important that you assess the level of evidence that you've actually gathered during the sort of investigation stages, and then you just engage with your legal representative who will be able to give you specifics on a case-by-case basis. On the flip side of what I've just mentioned about exaggerated claims and talking about frauds, it's extremely important for investigators to treat all customers fairly, and we're empathetic of and understanding of individual cases when investigating claims. And we need to remember that we do investigate genuine claimants on a very regular basis as well, and that claimant may be desperate in financial hardship and want to take a lower financial offer from the settlement. But all I'd say is don't interpret that it's a red flag or a fraud or an indicator of fraud. Okay, whenever I do these presentations, which is quite regularly, I always put up this particular slide, and it's what I call the AAA approach when you're looking at fraud. So it's to acknowledge that fraud is a threat to you and your business, accept that it could happen, and awareness for both employees and customers is the most important and effective preventative measure. So just the final few points of my presentation, just some of the conversations I've had with a few clients recently. They have identified some vulnerabilities, and they've come to us to ask us some advice. And if there is anyone at all on this particular webinar today that needs any advice at all, feel they may have any vulnerabilities, please feel free to reach out to myself or our global head of fraud, Bobby Gracie. So I trust that my presentation has been thought-provoking to enable you to consider this critical topic just in line with your own business requirements. And just finally, I appreciate the way in which I discuss fraud so passionately. It may come across that all customers are fraudsters. I think it's really important to mention again that it's only the minority of claimants and customers that actually do commit insurance fraud. So thank you very much indeed for listening.
Thank you, Simon. That was very interesting. I've got some questions here that have come through. The first one, Greg, is for you. It's about the care sector. What potential liabilities do care homes face, and have you seen a growth in claims from this sector?
Thanks, Nick. Interesting question. Well, I think the short answer is yes. We have seen a high percentage of claims rising as a result of those working in the care sector. I think straight off the bat, it's quite a unique set of circumstances that are in play there. You've got quite a high proportion of COVID-19 positive cases. You've got care workers operating in quite close proximity to those who are affected, and you've got a difficulty in implementing PPE to those who are affected, particularly in relation to mental health. So you've got a sort of a perfect storm of issues there that's leading to a number of cases. I think the other thing that strikes me on those cases is I think causation would be a very much more easier thing for claimants to prove. Certainly if you've got people working in an indoor setting with COVID positive patients and so on, I think those cases are more likely to play out in terms of legal liability, where we're looking to see an adequate risk assessment. We're looking to see that PPE has been provided, and we're also looking to see that the infection control systems are followed as far as can be. But undoubtedly, there's an element of risk that the employer can't take away. So we're into the grounds of perhaps non-negligent exposure. But they're my immediate thoughts. But we are seeing a large number of care claim cases.
Okay, thank you. A question for you, Simon, and it goes back to what you were talking about earlier about opportunist and desperation fraud. Have we seen a growth and a spike in that type of fraud, or is it too early to say at the moment?
We've seen a little bit of it, but I think it is too early to say. I think, as I mentioned during my presentation, Nick, I think we're really going to see the peak once the government schemes such as furlough and bounce back loans end. And, effectively, you might see a lot more unemployment where, people are looking at ways to, potentially get money that they no longer have.
Okay, thank you. Another one for you, Greg, and it's a very topical question following, obviously, the Prime Minister's address to the nation yesterday and about the easing of the lockdown restrictions. What risks will employers and other businesses face as the vaccine program develops, and also obviously as we start to ease the lockdown?
Right. Well, I think the employers and those controlling premises will try and benefit from the vaccine program, but I think there's going to be some issues there about people who don't want to take the vaccine, people perhaps pregnant workers, or people who are against the vaccine for other unrelated reasons. And I think to the extent to which employers can force people to have a vaccine is certainly doubted. That might affect new joiners, but certainly for existing people at work, it's going to be very difficult for employers to enforce those vaccinations. I think employers will have to look and see what sort of work they're doing, whether they are working in the care sector, whether they are putting people into people's homes to do jobs and to manage that risk. And just on a policy liability issue, we're seeing some PL policies, as I might have mentioned, now excluding COVID risks, and that's obviously a concern for people coming into premises. So undoubtedly there's a risk, and I think it's going to be a very difficult situation to manage.
Yeah, it's an interesting point about the emergence of exclusions on PL policies for COVID-19. Something to monitor very carefully. Another question for you, Simon, is about data analytics, something I don't really know a lot about. Hopefully you can enlighten us all.
My absolute best, Nick.
Yeah, okay. So are we seeing, a growth in the level of the use of data analytics, or is there more that can be done in this area?
I think data analytics has now been around for a long time, but it is increasing within, organisations and being deployed, because it's giving you that additional tool that you require. And data is absolutely key when you're looking to find fraud. And I think it's just part of people's fraud strategies moving forward. You are going to need that, and certainly I think with more claims automation as well, that's going to come in more fraud analytics looking at that. So for me, if you don't have some degree of fraud analytics within your claims management system, I think you're going to be missing a trick.
Well, that seems to be all the questions. So I think I'm going to bring the webinar to an end. Just a very quick reminder to everybody, there is going to be a short survey. It'd be very grateful if you could complete that. We're obviously very interested to get your feedback and suggestions for future events. And all that remains for me is to wish you a very good day for today, and hopefully we'll see you in the future with another Charles Taylor webinar. Thank you very much for joining us today. Much appreciated. Bye-bye for now.